Dracula.
Yeah. So this is a game where one player controls Dracula and is running around Europe trying to hide and seed vampires and grow in influence and take over the world. And then the other players are playing these hunters, Van Helsing, Dr. John Stewart, Lord Godalming, Mina Harker, 4 hunters who are trying to capture Dracula. And so there's a bunch of really interesting things going on here. But one of the most interesting things is, obviously, this is a 4 versus 1 game. Right? So it's not everybody against everybody.
Okay.
It's not a cooperative game where everybody's playing together.
Right.
It's a 1 versus 4. And obviously there's a lot of things that go into the game design to make this work. So Dracula is really strong, and the hunters have to work together. So what's interesting is that they start really weak. So Dracula can actually kind of prey on them in the beginning. But if they can catch them together, then they can really hurt.
So is it a partially cooperative game? So the
hunters are playing together.
Right.
So
the hunters are cooperating with each other.
It's a team game. So it's a team versus team, except one team is one person,
one
team
person.
and 4 persons.
Okay.
And it's a game of hidden movement and information. So as you can see, Dracula is not on the board. They don't know where he is. Dracula moves by playing these cards face down that show his location.
Okay.
So this is where he is. He was in Athens.
In Athens.
But they don't know that. So he's in this location. These are previous locations that he has visited. And when they stumble onto his trail, then he's revealed and they have to fight him. And again, so the hunters want to spread across Europe so as to kind of stumble on his trail somewhere. Mm-hmm. But then if they're really spread out and far from each other, they're weak. This is something that I think is useful in thinking a lot about simulations and active learning exercises that I've talked to you about. And again, we think often we want to give everybody the same assignment, the same experience. But actually, I think active learning simulations are a good opportunity to throw this balance out of whack. So that's one thing that cooperative games do a lot, but also this kind of games is people have different roles. Mm-hmm. And what's cool about that is that students learn by interacting with each other. And the fact that they're playing a role among other students empowers both sides to experience both ends of this role.
I could imagine this being especially interesting if students were simply assigned a role but didn't get to choose it, because I can imagine a situation in which you're like, here's a variety of roles that need to be filled, and students actually slot themselves into those. But I imagine it would be especially interesting, right, if they're kind of assigned roles.
Right. I almost always assign roles, and I think this is something instructors should do. Being Dracula is fairly stressful, so I would either give it to a student that can handle it, or I could ask for volunteers for specific ones. Often you'd have volunteers if something is particularly tough. But when you do a simulation and you have different countries, I love assigning, a head of state to certain students, and then like a foreign minister or like an ambassador. And I did this simulation game where students were in different groups, and the heads of state were not actually allowed to talk to each other at all. So they only had to communicate through their ambassador. You already have like this beautiful chain of command issues and a game of telephone where things break down. And students practice a lot of, so depending on what you're trying to teach them, right? But they practice a lot of skills. They also get all sorts of experiences about how quickly people fall into patterns. So you let a student become head of state, and he's the boss of a few fellow students. All of a sudden, dynamics change. And if that student is a fairly quiet student who otherwise is not particularly super bossy, you feel that tension, manifests immediately.
Yeah, this is reminding me of an experience that I had teaching distributive justice, like in Rawlsian style, right? But had a game in which we distributed candy based on playing like a game of Pictionary or something, right? And whoever won got the most amount of candy, whoever lost got the least. So I had, I think, 3 or 4 different groups with differing amounts of candy. And then the question after all was said and done was like, okay, do you think this is fairly distributed? Now it's up to you to fairly distribute the goods.
Yeah, fantastic. So you're using the endowment effect. People are like, but that's my candy.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And it was so fascinating to note what happened, because the ones with lots of candy were like, come get it. And then at some point I think they started throwing it, literally throwing it at the group that didn't have candy. And then meanwhile, the group that didn't have candy was sort of like, I don't care.
Wow.
Yeah, it was so fascinating.
Social status manifests each other.
Yeah.
Take your filthy candy.
Yeah. It was really, really fascinating. But
Yeah.
just having that bit of inequality in the roles assigned by something so simple as like distributing resources differently among different groups.
Yeah, so I like to do that. I think it introduces great dynamics. Specifically about ethics, I think it introduces a bunch of like groupthink and all sorts of dynamic that happen about people that twist the way people think ethically. And so it's a great opportunity to then debrief and ask people why they've done this way or the other way, because people that are adversarial want to do the opposite things no matter what. Another thing that Fear of Dracula does really well that I really love is asymmetric information. So I love in these kind of assignments and simulation to give some information to some students and not to everybody. So cooperative games, often would have each player would have one piece of information of the puzzle, but they can't directly communicate it to others. And that's sometimes awkward because people are like, if the rule says you can show each other the cards, people would be like, I have something that's higher than 6, but not 8 is pretty big, so.
Right.
But this game, the players can talk about their plans, but Dracula is listening. He's literally sitting on the table, right? So, Dracula has spies everywhere in Europe, so they can't talk secretly. They're not allowed. Dracula has to be in on all the conversations. And that's just a fantastic way to create actual tension, between like students or players without having this like, artificial rules where you say you can't share the information. You can share it, but then it helps this other team that you're playing against. Right? And Dracula knows where he is and where he's been, but they don't. And sometimes they know a piece of the information, and so that's the deduction element. I like giving, especially if you have large-scale simulations, often it's enough to just seed information with different students and then just watch it move around or not. Often students have all the information they need to kind of solve the issue, but they don't communicate well, and I think that's a really important learning experience. It also gives you an opportunity to talk later about perspectives. So people who have different information about what's going on would remember like the experience of where they were differently, and they would have a different explanation to why they did certain things. And also uncertainty is a remarkably important feature of our life. And thinking about ethics, often instructors eliminate uncertainty. They give you hypotheticals where there's no uncertainty.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's like this or this.
Right.
Right.
And we want students to practice judgment in the way that they will be making decisions later. So I like to produce, we want to reintroduce uncertainty, and one way to reintroduce uncertainty is having students deal with other students. Yeah, and I like the fact that, I like to put students in team to work against each other or separately, but the idea that it's kind of mind-breaking, but if you go with it, having one student versus a group of them, again, it's you could balance it with all the ways that we've said before. You can give them a lot more powers or whatever it is that is in the exercise. But I think it's a fairly interesting. So you want to talk about kingship and rulership and different classes. So you want to talk about inequality and a few people that are rich and have a lot of power. So you could do that kind of stuff, and you could give students. You can put most of the students in class in one situation, but only one or two in another situation, and that create dynamics that are actually fairly common in a lot of social situations, but we avoid them in the classroom for understandable reasons. But if you do them if you put thought into it, you can do it well.
Yeah, that actually seems like a very like powerful way to bring students a bit of like the outside world, right?
Yeah.
The real world
Yeah.
into the classroom.